I think we are now ready to begin, and I'm going to ask my colleague, Professor Fátima Vieira, the Vice Rector for Culture of the University of Porto and Coordinator of the Porto branch of CETAPS, to welcome us to this session in a few words.
Thank you, Rui, and good afternoon or good evening or even good morning, depending on your time zone. I would say that one of the advantages of these online events is that we reach a much wider audience across the world. And on behalf of the University of Porto, I'm truly pleased to participate in this opening session of these close relations, this new series of lectures organized by CETAPS, and I would say closely related to the research areas and research trends that deal with literature, culture, theater, and translation. And the prominent names that are already featuring on the program provide us with an idea of the quality to be expected. And that is why I'm so glad to know that this session is being streamlined. And I know that the plan is to have presential lectures in the future, but perhaps they can be also filmed and streamlined as well. So today's lecture certainly deserves to be highlighted. I would say that any lecture by Professor Peter Holland is a high-level lecture, for sure. So on behalf of the University of Porto, I'd like to thank you, Professor Peter Holland, for being available for this inaugural lecture, which, as described on the program, no doubt is a prominent Shakespearean event. And on behalf of the University of Porto, I would also like to thank Professor Rui Carvalho Homem for putting up such an interesting program for this year's series of lectures, which includes, as you know, Professors Lawrence Venuti in September, Maud Ellman in November, and Roy Foster in December. So I'm sure that they will all prove to be very much relevant for concerns in humanities. And it certainly is an honor to the University of Porto to host such an important program. So I give you the floor, Rui, so that you can introduce Professor Peter Holland.
Thank you very much, Fátima. And it's really both a personal and institutional pleasure and satisfaction to have the opportunity to introduce Peter Holland, obviously very well known to all of you. But let me just remind us all that Peter is the Macmill Family Professor in Shakespeare Studies at the University of Notre Dame, where Peter has been for something like 20 years now, after a period in which he was director of the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford-upon-Avon. Peter takes great pride in the fact that his chair is apparently the only Shakespeare endowed chair that is not in an English literature or a department of literature, but rather embedded in a department of film, television, and theatre. And this is something that is very much in evidence in Peter's research, in his output, and will be certainly in evidence also today. Now, Peter was editor of Shakespeare Survey for 19 years. He is one of the general editors of the Ardent Shakespeare 4th series. And as you will also all know, he's currently chair of the International Shakespeare Association. He has published as widely as we can imagine on Shakespeare. He has edited a number of plays. And this is a most fortunate coincidence. His latest book, titled Shakespeare and Forgetting, is published today. It's coming out exactly today. We couldn't have scheduled it in a more felicitous manner, the fact that we're hosting this lecture on the very day when this book that we'll all be looking forward to is indeed coming out, as we are indeed looking forward to Peter's lecture today, entitled, as you know, When is King Lear Not King Lear? Peter, thank you so much again for the very generous and kind manner in which you promptly accepted our invitation. We're looking forward to your lecture. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rui, and thank you, Fátima. I feel genuinely honored to be the first person in this series, and I listened to that list of names and heard my old friend and colleague Maud Ellman at the end of it, bookending the series so far. If you'll pardon the immodesty, I do want to share with you the screen that shows the cover of my book. I hope that's appearing. There we go. It's always so exciting to have a book actually out, and there it is, Shakespeare and Forgetting. Now, when one becomes an academic, one of the aspects of our profession that I find most difficult to deal with is the fact that we are often expected to produce a title for what we're going to talk about, and an abstract too, long before we've begun to think through properly what on earth our conference paper or other lecture is going to be about. And the result is often that one produces, as I have for today, something that is really rather too mysterious to tell our audiences much. If I'd thought early enough, then I think I would have given this a rather different title, but the publicity has started. I'm sorry that my screen is singing to you. I think if it had a subtitle, it would have been something like this: Adapting and Not Adapting King Lear on Film. Or perhaps something like this: When is an adaptation of King Lear not an adaptation of King Lear? But this is probably as mysterious as my main title. What my title certainly conjures up is a comment by Lear himself, comparatively early in the play, when furious at the treatment he's received from Goneril and her steward Oswald. Here it is in the folio text. Does any here know me? This is not Lear. Does Lear walk thus, speak thus? Where are his eyes? Either his notion weakens, his discernings are lethargid. Waking? 'Tis not so. Who is it that can tell me who I am? And the fool replies in that way that only Shakespeare manages to do, Lear's shadow. I've never quite been sure what kind of an answer this is, or rather, I'm sure that it constitutes a classic Shakespearean ambiguity. Is Fool saying that Lear's shadow can tell Lear who he is? Or is he saying that Lear is now only a shadow of Lear? Either is possible, both are probable. Lear cannot speak to his shadow, except insofar as the fool is himself in some ways Lear's shadow himself. For Fool is also saying that he, Fool, is the shadow who can tell Lear who Lear is. But the shadow of Lear both is and is not Lear, simultaneously a sign of his presence and a denial of his bodily existence. For though a shadow only exists by virtue of the existence of the body, it has in itself no bodily materiality. Actors, as Shakespeare reminds us in A Midsummer Night's Dream, are shadows themselves. As Puck says at the start of the play's epilogue, if we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended. But is he speaking as the character speaking in character, or is he speaking as the actor now that the play is over? So perhaps the one who can tell us who Lear is the actor playing Lear at that moment. And then he becomes part of a mise en abîme of existences vanishing into themselves, each one tied to, but distinct from the others. But the passage also conjures up for me, I wish my computer wasn't making those noises, another passage that fascinates me. Here is Troilus seeing Cressida with Diomed in the Greek camp and announcing, this is and is not Cressid. This object that he sees ought to be singular, a thing inseparate, indivisible, connected with all the previous occurrences of that individuality, that Cressidness that Troilus has encountered. And yet he cannot see this as a single being, only as something that divides more wider than the sky and earth. And it still retains such an interconnectedness that the spacious breadth of this division admits not the slightest gap, not an aperture or orifice, and Troilus's word is orifex, into which something as finely spun as thread from a spider's web could be inserted. Cressida and not Cressida both are and are not the same coherent self that he has previously known and loved. There is no way for him to disparage the two and disengage them, or to see them as connected. They, or rather she, appears to him as an impossible confection. Now, I'm going to be concerned throughout this talk with problems of films that may or may not be shadows of Lear, that may be visibly resonating with King Lear as their point or one of their points of origin, and yet they may also manifest themselves as something that is not Lear to some observers, as objects that to some connect and to others deny as emphatically their connectedness. The point of view defines for the observer which it is, and as in the uncertainty principle, the fact of observation alters the object into something defined and limited for each observer. It either is an example of Lear or an example of not Lear. How to begin then to see the ambiguities and disputedness of objects, of the desire to see movies as adaptations of King Lear, and yet also and simultaneously to question their status as such? Let me try to do so first by narrating a story of Hollywood, a story of studios and authorship and connectedness that may help to reveal the kinds of conundrums with which I am concerned. A narrative of the embeddedness of making and creating in structures that speak of claims of originating authorship in a culture of contested power and control. In 1941, Jerome Weidman, an American novelist now pretty much forgotten, published his third novel. His first, published in 1937 when he was only 26, was called I Can Get It For You Wholesale, an account derived from his own experiences of the sweatshops of the garment trade, the New York fashion industry. Accusations flourished that Weidman was displaying self-hatred towards his own Jewish identity, for the industry was dominantly Jewish-owned. And that gave the novel enough notoriety to make Weidman's debut moderately powerful. His third novel, and I can't resist showing you the title, the cover of the version that I have, let me go to it, is called I'll Never Go There Anymore. It's a coming-of-age story about a young man fresh out of college, again, probably autobiographical in part. I love the garish design of this paperback cover, provoking in us an immediate recognition of its genre, of what the novel is aiming to do as a Bildungsroman narrative of how, as it says at the top, a summer vacation thrust him into manhood. Let me lose this and with luck, lose the horrible dinging noise that it's making. A while later, the novel came to the attention of Sol Siegel, then a producer at 20th Century Fox, one of the most powerful of all the film studios. Siegel was in search of material that could be turned into a new film for the studio that would pick up on a new genre that was beginning to attract a lot of attention ever since Universal Studios' film The Naked City, directed by Jules Dassin. It follows a police's murder investigation in a way that is as much documentary as film noir and as much a study of the city of New York, as it is interested in its own storyline. Also, very unusually, that movie, Naked City, was shot entirely on location in New York. In Weidman's novel, I think Siegel spotted something that he could see as potentially a really good way to develop a new screenplay for his studio. And he found it not in the storyline of the whole novel, but simply in a single chapter, a chapter which fills in the backstory of one of the characters in the novel, a character called Max Maggio. How Siegel landed on this 25-page, rather dully written account of Max Maggio's backstory of a life, I don't know, but it was a perceptive move. He could see how this skeletal outline could be transposed both in medium, novel to film, and transposed in other ways too that I will come back to soon. A chapter that provided a narrative that we might now want to dub a meme, something ready for endless remaking. So Siegel hired Philip Jordan, then a young up-and-coming screenwriter, to write a screenplay. When Jordan, working under intense time pressure, turned in a draft of 3/4 of the script, Siegel thought it so poor, so unlikely to develop into anything filmable, that he sacked him on the spot. Daryl Zanuck, Fox's head of studio production, handed the project off to Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who had just completed making the film A Letter to Three Wives, for which Mankiewicz would soon win the Oscars for both Best Screenplay and Best Director. Joe was the younger brother of Herman Mankiewicz, who had co-written the screenplay of Citizen Kane with Orson Welles. If any of you saw last year's film Mank, you'll know what this is all about. But Zanuck gave Joe Mankiewicz a choice between doctoring Jordan's draft and substantially rewriting, and Mankiewicz chose the latter. The best account I know of the process that led to the eventuating film, that was now to be called House of Strangers, sees the witty, hard-boiled dialogue as, I quote, certainly all Mankiewicz. The film, starring Edward G. Robinson and Richard Conte as father and son, didn't do well. But what really infuriated Mankiewicz was a ruling from the Screenwriters Guild that the credit for the writing should read on screen, I quote, original story by Philip Jordan, screenplay by Philip Jordan and Joseph L. Mankiewicz. Mankiewicz was so angry that he refused to take any credit at all, rather than share it with Jordan when so little of the screenplay was Jordan's. In 1954, a few years later, Siegel remade House of Strangers, now shifting its genre from noirish urban crime into a Western that was now titled Broken Lance, and it starred Spencer Tracy and was directed by Edward Dmytryk. Though the screenplay was by Richard Murphy, Jordan, who did nothing whatsoever on this project, was given credit for the original story, and that is his work in unsuccessfully transforming I'll Never Go There Anymore into House of Strangers. And what's more, he earned the Oscar for Best Original Story for it. Triumphantly, Jordan placed a 2-page ad in Variety, the trade paper, that read simply, "Thank you, Sol Siegel." And Siegel, also now furious, wired via Variety that Jordan had nothing to do with the film, but his wire was never printed. There would be 2 further transformations of this story. In 1956, what was claimed to be a TV adaptation by Morris Zim of Philip Jordan's screenplay was directed by Lewis Allen as an episode in the television drama series The 20th Century Fox Hour as something called The Last Patriarch, starring as the son John Cassavetes, then absolutely on the verge of movie fame that would come with his performance in Edge of the City the following year. And finally, in 1961, this same story, this same narrative, moved to yet another film genre, this time a circus movie called The Big Show, starring Esther Williams, best known to us for her performances in musicals that always involved her swimming. And this would be her last Hollywood movie. So there my narrative of process ends. And it's time to turn to the details of the narratives of the 3 films themselves. I've yet to find a way to watch The Last Patriarch, the TV version, or to find any synopsis of its action. And the reason for my pursuit of this thread is, of course, as you will have anticipated, that all 3 of these films, House of Strangers, Broken Lance, and The Big Show, have been seen as King Lear adaptations. And all 3 appear in Douglas Lanier's astonishing, virtuosic listing of many hundreds of such films in his sections on film spin-offs and citations in Richard Burt's 2-volume encyclopedia of Shakespeare's After Shakespeare. Now, not one of these 3 movies directly cites King Lear at all. There is no line from the play, no name that echoes a character name, no passing reference to the play, no example of the kind of referential citation that indicates an awareness of allusion, an encouragement to search for connections. To take a strikingly different example, in a film called Life Goes On, a beautiful, moving 2009 film directed by Sangeeta Datta, to which I will return later, the youngest of Dr. Sanjay Banerjee's 3 daughters, Dia, is an aspiring actor still at drama school. And early in the film, we watch a rehearsal scene from King Lear with Dia as Cordelia. Incidentally, the actor playing King Lear in this sequence in the film is Rene Weiss, better known as Shakespeare scholar rather than a Shakespeare actor. He thinks he's terrible in the scene. He's the only example I know of somebody with the multiple talents both to edit the play and to play the title role. So in case the audience hadn't yet picked up the connections between Life Goes On and King Lear, the scene nudges us into awareness. But there's nothing remotely like that in the 3 Hollywood films I've been tracking. And equally, no such reference appears in Weidman's novel. Indeed, I've come to suspect, perhaps unfairly, that I'm actually the first person to read the novel in the context of considering these films. Weidman has introduced Max Maggio, the characters whose backstory he will trace in this crucial chapter, as an enigmatic individual, good at his job, auditing accounts for various companies, but curt and unfriendly towards the novel's young hero. And then the hero's boss, Dorganisht, a childhood friend of Max Maggio, tells him what happened. Max's father was a barber with 4 sons. The father had given up cutting hair and had done extraordinarily well through a new career in financial investments and loans as a small-scale local banker. He'd made enough to send all 4 of his sons to law school, and Harvard Law School no less, and to set them up in offices on Wall Street. 3 turn into dull, safe corporate lawyers, marrying into respectable families, while Max, the eldest, becomes a criminal lawyer with strong links to organized crime. Brilliantly successful, Max flaunts his wealth in a playboy lifestyle, and then when the father has a heart attack, the father admits to Max that he's been subpoenaed in an investigation into what the novel awkwardly calls usurious practices. Max proposes to his brothers a solution. They will forge a series of documents that make Max the president of the company and would therefore leave the father in the clear, for the old man will never survive a trial, and all 4 brothers will share the responsibilities of the company. The other 3 immediately refuse to be involved, and Max throws them out of the house. Max's fortune and his father's are sufficient to pay back those his father has defrauded, and Max avoids jail time, though he is disbarred as a lawyer. A mere 2 months after the trial, oh, cruel irony of melodrama, Max's self-sacrifice proves to have been in vain when the father dies of another heart attack. Max rebuilds his fortune only to lose it again in the Wall Street crash of 1929, and a broken man, he's been doing the routine work for Dorganisht for very little pay for 6 years. So what in this even suggests King Lear? Weidman is not remotely interested in the father, to whom he doesn't even give a name, nor in the 3 unnamed brothers. The father is passive throughout. He doesn't propose dividing up his company or forging the documents that transfer power away from himself. Now, obviously, changing the gender of the children doesn't matter. Akira Kurosawa's wonderful 1985 adaptation of King Lear as Ran, meaning chaos, gives his King Lear, Hidetora, 3 sons. Nor does changing the number of children 4 rather than 3, nor even that Max, who has, for those who want to see this narrative as Lear-like, to function as a Cordelia figure, is the eldest, not youngest. Max's self-sacrificial act is moving and caring, but it's not remotely similar to anything Cordelia does. And Max survives, his life destroyed not by his act to save his father, but by the blunt instrument of the Wall Street crash. Try as I might, I simply cannot find King Lear here. There is, I feel reasonably confident in saying, in this an example of not King Lear. Nor have I come across a suggestion that Weidman's narrative is any kind of version of Lear. Mankiewicz's screenplay makes a number of adjustments to Weidman's plot. House of Strangers is both a narrative of an upwardly mobile Italian-American immigrant family, and it's also something of an allusion to the activities of the Giannini family, who founded Bank of America. It's a kind of film à clé, apparently alluding to a very famous contemporary family. Amadeo Giannini took over control of Bank of America from somebody called Ora Monet, and the father figure in House of Strangers is named Monetti. But of course, any powerful family may find itself alluded to. Spyros Skouras, who was at this point the president of 20th Century Fox, was rumored to have found the screenplay uncomfortably close to his own rise to power. Plainly, we're in the world of noirism, overlaid with something that would years later become the mafia stories of The Godfather. And of course, there are many very deliberate echoes of King Lear in The Godfather Part 3, while another mafia movie, Men of Respect, an attempt to ride on the wave of Coppola's success, is a version of Macbeth. House of Strangers, though, makes the father, Gino Monetti, the Edward G. Robinson role, into a brutal patriarch whose abuse of 3 of his sons goes some way to justifying their refusal to help him avoid the reach of the Banking Act by going along with Max's plan of sharing financial responsibility among the 4 of them. And Gino's favoring of Max both explains Max's willingness to take the rap for his father and his siblings' willingness to betray him to the police. While Max is in jail for jury tampering, the brothers take control of the bank and oust Gino, humiliating him by putting him on an allowance. And when Max comes out of prison, he tells his brother that at his father's behest, he has vowed revenge. But the film ends with him marrying a non-Italian and moving away to California. Now, the very strength of Gino's presence in the plot of this film and his abrasive and authoritarian control over his family start to make a possible King Lear reworking visible. Read it against King Lear, and the variations start to become intriguing. It is, as it were, Cordelia, not Lear, Max, not Gino, who proposes dividing the kingdom, i.e. the control of the bank, with Joe, Pietro, and Tony, the other 3 brothers, as it were, Regan and Goneril in disguise, who resist, rather than, as in Shakespeare, Cordelia who refuses to play the game, and Regan and Goneril who are eager for their share. There is, in the screenplay for the film, no journey for Gino as Lear to undergo. Instead, he, as Lanier puts it, offers a spirited justification of his mistreatment of his sons and dies unrepentant, end quote. I've not yet been able to trace when House of Strangers first begins to be referred to as a Lear spin-off. And it's not House of Strangers, but Broken Lance, the second in the 3 films that I'm interested in at this stage, that has most frequently been viewed as an adaptation of Lear. Broken Lance is certainly a version of House of Strangers, though it adds in striking characteristics of its own. In this family, the Devereux family is more complex in its family structures than the Manettis. For Matt, the father has remarried, and Joe, the youngest of his children and the one who goes to prison to save his father, is half-brother to the other three. The second wife, always referred to in the film as Senora Devereux, is not Spanish nor Mexican, but firmly defined as Native American, a Comanche, what the film's trailer calls the beautiful stepmother, as if Matt's giving her an identity so that she might pass as Spanish would have mitigated the racist abuse that she, and again the trailer's description, her half-breed son, receive from her stepsons. The family tensions that result produce an entirely different narrative arc. For the violent aggression that Ben Devereux, the oldest brother, sustainedly manifests towards his father for his choice of second wife and towards his half-brother, eventuates in a climactic fight at the end of the film between Ben and Joe, with Joe's life saved only by the long-range shot that kills Ben from the rifle of Two Moons, a Native American, protecting someone ethnically linked to himself. In a brief and rather curt article in the Shakespeare and Film newsletter in 1977, at a time when the study of Shakespeare and film and equally adaptation studies were in their infancy, Bernice Kleiman, a great Shakespeare scholar and an early investigator of Shakespeare on film, announced that, if I can go to it successfully on my screen, Kleiman's very brief article simply announced, "Broken Lance is not Lear." And I'll leave her description of it up on screen so you can see the way that she was thinking about it. I hope that the font size is big enough for you to be able to do so. That wasn't in itself enough to stop Shakespeareans from getting into a discussion about whether this was or was not going to be a proper version of King Lear. Gosh, how I wish that noise would go away. Over the years, scholars have continued to play with the film as an adaptation, engaging with it, for instance, as elegiac Western or as a document in the history of America's representations of its racism. But all of those discussions depends on an acceptance by each writer at least that the film is helpfully viewed as Shakespeare modulation. What matters in each and every account that sees Broken Lance as a Lear adaptation is how it changes King Lear, not how it is supported by it. It is how Broken Lance is not King Lear, or at least how it uses the play by altering it, that intrigues the Shakespeare critics who consider it, not the ways in which it is following Shakespeare, being a new version of King Lear. Now, of course, adaptation is a process of transformation. Of course, each new version changes its source, as House of Strangers changed Weidman's novel, and Broken Lance changes House of Strangers. Of course, intention on the part of author or screenplay writer, or director or studio publicity machine is not the sole determinant of identification of adaptation, or rethinking, or influence. I accept that for the scholars who resist Kleiman's rejection of Broken Lance as a version of King Lear, the film does function potently in relation to the play. And I'm consistently interested in the ways they read the film. But they don't show me how to engage with the film as King Lear in any way that sparks my attention. Here is a significantly different example. Broken Lance may well have chosen to name one of the sons Joe because the name was used in House of Strangers. But when its version of Joe is attacked by his half-brothers, I easily accept that this Joe conjures up the biblical Joseph, the most beloved of sons and the most hated of brothers. But the attempt to divide up the Devereux cattle empire in the film is not a division for dowry so that future strife may be prevented now, as Lear puts it in the folio text, but instead it's a legal maneuver to avoid losing the family business to the copper company whose suit for damages lands Matt in court. And the idea comes not from Matt himself, but from a friend of his, Horace, the unfriendly governor. And what in the play is an initiator of the action is in the film a tactic invoked only very late in the runtime. If this is a rethinking of Lear, it is so only belatedly, not as that crucial first step in the performed plot. Certainly, Philip Yordan's mind is running on Shakespeare adaptation around this time because he co-wrote the screenplay for Joe Macbeth, which was released in 1955, an underrated version of the play as gangster movie. And the game of tracing echoes, resonances, and links, which is always fun to play, makes me wonder whether Yordan, when he saw Broken Lance, to which he had contributed nothing, filed away for future use Matt Devereux's extraordinary death, hit by a stroke as he's galloping after his sons and dying in the saddle, staying on the horse so that the horse trots his corpse past the astonished sons, a moment that may have influenced the spectacular end of Yordan's screenplay for the epic El Cid in 1961, when Charlton Heston's dead Roderigo is strapped to his horse to lead his army to victory posthumously. We're in an area of work which, from my reading in adaptation studies, has far too rarely been thought about. What happens when there may be a fundamental disagreement as to whether a text is or is not an adaptation of another text? When I look at the stack of DVDs of King Lear movies in my study, this trio, House of Strangers, Broken Lance, and The Big Show, are alone in their ambiguous status. Some other films have Lear in their title, like The Yiddish King Lear of 1935, or they name their main character, say, John Lear, as in King of Texas in 2002, with Patrick Stewart in the role. There's no doubt about how Christian Levering's Dogma 95 film, The King is Alive, riffs on King Lear, or the 1997 film version of Jane Smiley's novel, 1,000 Acres. And this dispute over these three films that I've been concerned with, House of Strangers, Broken Lance, and in passing, Big Show, the dispute is not currently subject to some kind of proof. Perhaps lurking in Mankiewicz's archive or Yordan's, there will be a piece of paper that says, I'm going to turn Weidmann's chapter into a version of King Lear. But I somehow doubt we'll ever find such a document. No early reviewer of any of these three films mentions the link. No one thinks of these films as adaptations until Shakespeare scholars do, as if we've imposed the reading through our own perspective. Precisely because we want to expand our field into family crime drama or Western or even circus movies, these three films have been colonized and annexed as part of the ever-growing empire of Shakespeare. Somehow anything can become Shakespeare if you want it to be. Now, of course, some of the problem with dealing with such cases in adaptation studies has been the ongoing struggle over notions of fidelity, as if the status of an adaptation is inherent in the object. And I'm going to make horrid noises and share my screen again in order to be able to quote from a fine article that is exploring this by Nico Di Cecco. What Di Cecco argues is that adaptation, he says, is not essentially a form at all, but rather a potential response to form. Part of the pleasure of adaptation, he goes on to say, comes from identifying intertextual links, What requires more thorough attention, though, is the fact that this pleasure does not depend on an explicit formal announcement of deliberate adaptation. Rather, he goes on, when we shift emphasis from an ontological interest in what adaptations are to a performative or discursive interest in what adaptations, the possibility arises that audiences might misidentify a text as an adaptation and nonetheless experience the same enjoyment. In other words, he concludes this argument, it is possible to pursue the pleasures associated with identifying an adaptation as such from the standpoint of a misrecognition of form. Then there is an even greater reason to develop models of adaptation that decentralize the formal definitions of phenomena. It's a fine argument, and he goes on to explore it very effectively in the article from which I quoted. But he offers no ground for knowing what would be such a misidentification. Misidentification is something that one name calls somebody else's choice, but it's not something that we have a framework to decide about. I want to turn now to a different kind of change for the last few minutes of my talk. Something that restores to the Lear narrative, even in the act of adapting it, what Shakespeare seems deliberately to have left out. Something already glimpsed in passing in Broken Lance, and that will prove to be crucial in Life Goes On. Now, it's a familiar fact that Shakespeare's plays are rather short of references to presumed but absent mothers and wives. Lear only once refers to his wife. When he imagines Goneril as a mother, he may curse her with barrenness, but he doesn't refer to her mother. Only when Regan arrives at Gloucester's castle and greets Lear with the line, "I am glad to see your highness," he responds with the extraordinary statement, "Regan, I think you are. If thou shouldst not be glad, I would divorce me from thy mother's tomb, sepulchring an adulteress," the one and only mention in the play of Lear's wife. Shakespeare's major source for his play is a play often dubbed by scholars King Lear the Unpronounceable, because we can't differentiate in speech the difference between Shakespeare's play, L-E-A-R, and the King Lear play, L-E-I-R, that is the play's major source. That play opens with Lear and his nobles entering from the burial of his queen. As Lear himself puts it in this play, "Thus to our grief, the obsequies performed of this our too late deceased and dearest queen, whose soul I hope possessed of heavenly joys doth ride in triumph amongst the cherubims." The death and funeral of his wife is the explicit prompt that leads him to ask his nobles for advice about what to do with his daughters. For, as he puts it, the women are wanting now their mother's good advice, under whose government they have received a perfect pattern of a virtuous life. It's fascinating material as a way of entering the play. The loss of a spouse, the gender division for raising children, the lack of a son, all of these could have been powerful drivers for Shakespeare's opening, but he uses none of them. As the playwright Howard Barker puts it in the introduction to his exhilarating play, 7 Lears, Shakespeare's King Lear, he writes, is a family tragedy with a significant absence. The mother is denied existence in King Lear. She is barely quoted even in the depths of rage or pity. She was therefore expunged from memory. This extinction can only be interpreted as repression, end quote from Barker. As repression, expunction, and extinction, the absence of the wife-mother from Shakespeare's play is something that more recent King Lear adaptations have been prepared to rethink. Take, for example, a film called My Kingdom, Don Boyd's movie from 2002 that transposes King Lear to modern-day Liverpool in the north of England and a gangster culture that controls the city, with Richard Harris in one of his very last film roles as Sandyman, the crime boss who views the whole city as his kingdom, hence the title of the film. It opens with scenes of family. It's close to Christmas, and Sandyman and his wife Mandy go to a performance of Handel's Messiah in the cathedral in Liverpool, a performance for which they arrive late, and during which Sandyman answers his mobile phone, bringing the performance to a temporary halt, but no one quite dares to tell the crime boss to put his phone away. Afterwards, as they leave well before the end, this happens, and I'm going to run just a short extract from the film.
Why are we leaving?
Smell that, Mandy. Steamships, iron shavings.
What's you rambling on about?
I'm thinking about the past. This great city, mine. I'm thinking about the first time I ever walked under a Liverpool sky.
You're in a funny mood today.
I just want to remember it. That's all. Let's go.
Hey, wait up. Wait. We should take the boy with us when we go to Lanzarote and take pictures.
I think it's a good idea. We'll get him away from all of this before he changes.
Give me the bag.
You know who I am? Have you any idea who I am?
Look. Slow.
That's better.
Look, I'm gonna pull this thing, right? And it's gonna go in your face.
I'll be sure you don't miss.
Just give me it now. Look.
Go on.
I want the money, and I want the money now.
Oh, Mandy. Give this bloody idiot the bag. Mandy. Oh, God.
And that precipitates the whole tragedy. Except that in this narrative, there are unexpected survivors, especially Lear, Sandyman, and Jo, the Cordelia daughter, a recovering drug addict who refuses to share in his criminal empire that her father gives to each of his children, carrying out the retirement plan that he'd begun to sketch to Mandy in the car on the way to the concert, and now carries out as a natural consequence of his grief. The film's final shots make the survival of father and daughter ambiguous through camera angle and location as they exit the shot in different directions, alive but not reunited, leaving us unsure about the next events beyond the credits, as it were. But their corpses are not added to the film's high body count. The equivalents to Gloucester, Cornwall, Regan, Goneril and the Fool, the last being one of Sandyman's grandchildren, all die, with this version of Gloucester able to do what Shakespeare's character had wished to do, commit suicide. Brutally violent and profoundly moving, the film takes full advantage of the effect of opening with the normalized family, one of the recurrent tropes of crime dramas, here complete with the mother. It's Mandy who emphasizes the normality of this family. Lynn Redgrave, who played Mandy, was the only other major star in the film, and squandering her only 12 minutes in is an even more extreme example of what Alfred Hitchcock did in having Janet Leigh murdered so early in Psycho. But the resonances of her presence and the depths of her absence enable the precariousness of this family to be irremediably and immediately destabilized. For all its mechanisms of drug smuggling and crime empires, My Kingdom keeps returning to its central concern with family drama, just as intense in its focus on that as is King Lear, even though the state of the nation in one and of the crime kingdom of Liverpool in the other are at stake. What Shakespeare chooses to achieve without the mother is here created precisely by making the mother so strongly visible before erasing her. If, as I'm suggesting, the present, albeit brief, of the mother might be a sign of the not King Lear, My Kingdom demonstrates that its thoughtful exploration of King Lear is successfully premised on her presence. And that is even more true of the film I'm going to end by talking about, Sangeeta Datta's film, Life Goes On. Set in London, modern London, contemporary London, it opens with Dr. Sanjay Banerjee, a successful and wealthy doctor, returning home to find his wife, Manju, collapsed on the floor. Rushed to hospital, she's declared dead. The film's time span is the 6 days between her death and the funeral. Its movement is frequently punctuated by images of her, like the one that became the film's main publicity. Everything that Sanjay has to cope with is redefined by the unbearable grief of his wife's death. Even his youngest daughter's revelation that she is in a relationship with and is pregnant by a Muslim. As Kinga Foldvari puts it in her excellent recent book on, as she calls them, cowboy Hamlets and zombie Romeos, I quote, contrary to the tragic fate of half the cast of Shakespeare's drama, in this British Asian melodramatic retelling of King Lear, the only character who dies is the one who was not even supposed to be there, end quote. The return of the mother here is not a depoliticizing of the film's thinking about King Lear. Life Goes On is as powerfully concerned with the multiple forms of dispossession and displacement, of emigration and immigration, of the religious differences that define nations and local murderous hatred, and of the complexities of sexual politics. Each of Sanjay's 3 daughters is in a relationship that poses a cultural problem for him. Lolita, the oldest, her husband is white, and the marriage is in trouble both because of his career ambitions and his adultery. Tuli, the middle daughter, is lesbian, and so obsessed with her career as a sports journalist that she hasn't seen her parents for 2 months. And, as I've mentioned, Dear's partner is Muslim. This last provokes in Sanjay not only an explosion of his deep racist hatred for all Muslims, but it also summons up his own terrible memories of his experiences at the time of the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947 and the racial massacres that it prompted. Dear's partner's name is Imtiaz, same name as Sanjay's boyhood friend in Dhaka, who was part of the mob that burned down Sanjay's parents' house and whose own family was killed by a Hindu mob in revenge. Sanjay's sense of his own patriarchal authority, perhaps even more central here than in King Lear, is profoundly interlaced with his belief in his Bengali identity as racial, religious, national, and cultural, something that is not to be carried into the next generation, and which is subverted by the sharing among the 4 women, mother and 3 daughters, of their knowledge of each other's secrets, all of which have been kept from the father. As Foldvari points out, the mother's space is emphatically domestic. Though Manju had a job outside the home in a library, we never see her working there, only once leaving it at the end of the workday. Her space is dominantly within the home and garden and in a nearby park, where Sandeman's kingdom is outside the home and Sanjay's social status is profoundly important to him as a professional man in a community that accepts and respects him. Manju's domain is in one sense conventionally defined as female in its domesticity, but also as a space across which the multiple politics traverse. And King Lear is everywhere in this film's narrative. In the aftermath of Manju's death, Sanjay wants the daughters to share in a trust that would divide his wealth among the three, and the wealth is considerable. The London house alone is valued at £5 million. Dear Cordelia refuses because of her anger at her father's outright rejection of her Muslim partner. And at the film's end, Dia and Sanjay are reconciled after he spends a night walking the streets in a storm, found in the dawn asleep on a park bench, looking out across the city. This Lear's Heath scene seems to have ended up on Hampstead Heath, the vast parkland in the north of London. I might find some of the references to the play in the film a little heavy-handed, not so much that Dia is playing Cordelia in a college production, but the moment when Lolita tells her father, you know what the other two girls call you? King Lear. Or when Sanjay says, you know, I love Lear, when he's looking at Lolita's baby, and quotes from it, not entirely accurately. We came crying hither. Thou knowest the first time that we smell the air, we wail and cry, that we are come to this great stage of fools. Much more successful, much more powerful are the moments when we hear Sanjay's voice in voiceover. For example, Blow Winds as he walks through the storm, or I'm a foolish fond old man as he hugs Dear the next day, or We two alone will sing like birds in the cage as the reunited family, including Imtiaz, release white balloons into the sky after Manju's cremation. So there is absolutely no question about this being a King Lear adaptation. And that licenses me to find Shakespeare references elsewhere in Sangeeta Datta's film, because she wrote the screenplay as well as directing it. So, given the explicitness of the presence of Lear in Life Goes On, I want to worry at some of those other possible resonances. Again, trying to see how far the search for Shakespeare, for me unconvincing and broken lance, might go here. Alongside its Shakespeare references, the film makes extensive and deliberate use of songs by Rabindranath Tagore, the great Bengali writer, whose statue has, as it happens, been placed in the gardens of Shakespeare's birthplace in Stratford-upon-Avon. His songs are linked to Manju, whom we see as a singer and sitar player in the home in a number of the flashbacks. Here are the words of one of them. If new bonds hide your old love, behind the web of new relationships, remember me, still remember me. If I am close by you, like an elusive shadow, between truth and dream, remember me. I cannot help but think of Manju, therefore, as Sanjay's shadow. I am close by you like an elusive shadow, just as the fool speaks for a moment, possibly of himself as Lear's shadow, as I quoted at the start of this talk. The new relationships have, by the film's end, begun to be structured, always with the remembered space of Manju's absence, but an absence differently inflected through the film's multiple revelations of hidden histories, be it of the relationship between Manju and Sanjay's closest friend years earlier, or the history of Sanjay and his parents leaving Bengal, about which his daughters know nothing. And the repeated "remember me" of the song makes me remember Hamlet's father's ghost, similarly repeated injunction. But perhaps that belongs in a future paper to be called When is Hamlet Not Hamlet? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for a lecture so rich in insights and in critical possibilities. Now, you have very generously agreed to take a few questions, so let me prompt our audience to start raising their virtual hands. I'll try to monitor that, the list of participants, and be attentive to that. And while that does not happen, Peter, I'll probably use my position as host to ask well, I suppose a very broad question. I was listening to you on the conditions under which we can detect a connection, a derivative bond, something that will allow us to say, ah, yeah, this is clearly indebted to that other object in the same or another medium. And of course, I mean, it raises difficulties when you can't get anything definite at the textual level, or there are doubts in terms of structural homologies and this and that. And I suppose we were all taught at some point to be skeptical about intentions. At least I was. I was a member of what Seamus Heaney once called my new critically trained generation. And of course, we were dismissive about such things as intentions. But I was wondering, are we ready to accept that it's enough to make a case for, you know, the sense, even the necessity of reading two things relationally, if you feel that it's productive, that you derive a deeper understanding of one or even both objects from that exercise, even if you can't find those explicit and unequivocal footholds, textual, structural, whatever. Can you endorse that?
I can, and the crucial proviso for me is that there is something productive in that relationship that is being uncovered. And my problem with the House of Strangers Broken Lance examples is that I don't find in the accounts that have been offered of the connection between, or supposed connection between those two films and King Lear, anything that is productive in defining that relationship. I don't see what I've learned about how the films are tackling their problems through that relationship. Whereas in the other kinds of examples, it seems to me a hugely productive interrelationship. I mean, My Kingdom entirely depends on our seeing it as an adaptation of King Lear. Life Goes On almost obsessively harps on its relationship. So I'm trying to get at those boundary lines, those vague points where some may find it fruitful, but I'm afraid I haven't been able to find it fruitful, and therefore I'm not convinced that there is indeed a relationship when there is nothing that is being offered to provoke the relationship as being defined within the film. So it's a problem, and my problem is augmented by that awareness that I really just don't understand why adaptation studies hasn't tried to engage with this particular problem. And I've been looking around and trying to find examples of people trying to think through this problem, and I can't find it.
So you still find this area of inquiry too bound, too dependent on the factuality of a bond, of a textual nature, of a structural nature?
That's exactly right. I mean, it's as if it needs that connection in order to produce something. And if one doesn't observe the same connectedness, then the relationship stops being fruitful. Now, it is intriguing that people want to find these films to be King Lear adaptations, when I, for one, don't find them to be so. But it says more about what the desire is of the search for the relationship, rather than something that effectually releases something in the film. So it becomes an analysis of a reception problem, rather than an analysis of something within the films themselves.
I've been trying to monitor the list of participants on the right of my screen, looking for raised hands indicating the wish to ask questions. I can't see any there at the moment, but if any among our audience are not familiar with that particular device, that particular resource on Zoom that would allow you to, get my attention through that raised blue hand, but would still like to ask a question, just please speak out. I won't mind.
Can I pick up on a question that has appeared in the chat?
Oh, you're right. Sorry, I missed that. Yeah.
From Natalie Bien-Guerra.
Yeah, please go ahead, Peter. Sorry, I had missed that.
Let me quote what Natalie asks, isn't this what Maurizio Calbi has called spectral Shakespeare? And I agree. I think to some extent, Maurizio's book is tremendous and powerful and thoughtful about this kind of thing. But the kinds of ghosts, the spectral presences of Shakespeare that he's looking at, I find so much more exciting and convincing than these examples that I've been looking at in this. And again, it's about what is the productive result of the interrelationship that seems to me to matter. I don't know, Natalie, if you want to comment further on that. I've, as it were, taken your question and just answered it. But hi, I can see you there.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for your answer. I understand what you mean. Well, I was wondering, trying and clarify what is King Lear, not King Lear. It amounts to defining yourself. What is a King Lear? And so, what is your idea of King Lear? And in the volume that we published on Shakespeare on Screen on King Lear, there was this concept that we borrowed from, I can't remember what contributor, but Sarah will remember, which is the idea of Learness, or the concept of Learness, and the concept of Romeo and Julietness. How do we define this? And well, that was one of the questions that were raised in that book on Shakespeare on King Lear on Screen. So
Sarah has said in the chat that she remembers it's Lois Levine who came up with that idea of Learness in her chapter in that book, which is, let me say, I mean, I know I'm in it. I did a short afterword for that volume, but the volume is releasing increasing riches as my own thinking about the play continues in its adaptations. I like that quality of Learness that Lois Levine engages with. Again, I don't find it in the films I've been looking at. Sarah has asked in the chat what I think about the 3 television series, Boss, Empire and Succession, each of which has been considered as appropriations of Lear. And the answer is I'm saving up to my time to binge watch them because they're not series I followed. And so I haven't yet started to investigate whether they can be effectively seen. I did try, I have to admit, the first couple of episodes of Succession, and with my daughter's encouragement, and wasn't hugely excited to continue as kind of, fun viewing, but I'll do it for work. And let me come back to you, Sarah, on that later on when I've done my homework.
Any other questions? I was wondering, Peter, I mean, your title, Shakespeare and Forgetting, of course, I haven't been able to read it. It hasn't come out yet, but I will soon. I remember Brian Friel once had a character in one of his plays say, to remember everything is a form of madness. Selective forgetting, is that a form of health?
Unquestionably, we need to forget. I mean, one of the crucial things that enables us to survive is the ability to forget. One of the things I look at in the book at one point are people who are known as hypomnesiacs, like the person that Lear studies, who cannot forget anything, or the figure in the Borges short story, Funesta Memorias, as it's often called in English translation, people whose lives are destroyed by the inability to forget. I see Werner Brönnemann's virtual hand in the virtual air.
Please, yes, switch on your mic, Werner, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
All right. One parallel I see between Broken Lance and King Lear is the deviation from the usual behavior in that Devereux expresses sympathy and understanding, and also considerable pity for the predicament of the Native Americans, which could be linked with the poor naked wretches speech, that also, in a way, is not quite typical of Lear overall, before that speech.
I like that notion very much, and I see what you're driving at with it. If one accepts it as a Lear adaptation, then of course it will conjure up poor naked wretches, and I get that. On the other hand, American film around this time is trying to engage with it, the history of Western expansion and the relationship with Native Americans in wholly new ways. And this Broken Lance is really quite radical in the way in which it pursues that concern. It's really rather subversive of the conventional image in Westerns of Native Americans as unacceptably hostile people who are unwarrantably annoyed because their land is being taken away from them. Something that in America has now turned into the land acknowledgement that so many people make in their email signature and so on. So again, I can see the point if one accepts the film as connected. If one can't accept that premise, then I don't see it necessarily as connection. You see the problem I'm grappling with, and indeed, if we had time, if we were doing this in a rather different way, we would look at all the accounts that people have been offering of Broken Lance as adaptation and see whether it begins to add up to something convincing enough, or whether Bernice's abrupt little note just saying, no, it isn't, is a different way and better way of doing it. Perhaps I ought to try this out on some of my students without telling them that I'm not sure whether it is an adaptation or I don't feel it is an adaptation, and see whether they, simply by virtue of my presenting it as in a class on adaptations of Lear, whether they would therefore accept it or whether they'd also feel a little bit curious about it.
Thank you again, Peter. I can't see any other raised hands or questions in the chat. We've already kept you for an extra 15 minutes. So, Peter, you can count on our enthusiastic applause, both for the lecture and for your generous willingness to join us in this debate. And let me, thank our audience very much. Wish that we can all convene on future occasions without wanting to pester you with an advertisement. Let me point out that if you visit our website at CETAPS.com, you will see already the calendar for other events. On the 30th September, we'll have Lawrence Venuti on a universal tendency to debase retranslations. On the 12th November, Maud Ellman on borderation fictions of the Northern Irish border, and on the 2nd December, Roy Foster, title to be confirmed, but it will again involve Irish issues. So let me wish you all an excellent evening and an excellent weekend. And thank you again. Thank you very warmly, Peter. See you all at some point soon. Bye for now. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.